All right, good afternoon and good morning, seventh graders. Welcome back. Today we're going to look at Chapter 4, Section 3, the Southern Colonies. Previous mini lectures and classes talked about the New England colonies and the Middle colonies. Today we're going to look at the 5 Southern colonies in Chapter 4, Section 3. Let's look at the vocab terms that appear in the reading. The entire vocab deck will appear on Quizlet.com, and I will also post the decks. Typically, I'll post them daily on your Google Classroom feed as you prepare for your vocab quizzes. Chapter 4, Section 3, the Southern Colonies. First vocab term, debtor, silent B, debtor. A debtor is a person who owed money but could not pay it back. Smaller word there is debt. A person who is in debt is called a debtor, a person who owed money but could not pay it back. Indigo is a plant used to make a valuable blue dye. This plant is grown in the South, very, very important during the colonial era. Slave codes are laws that controlled the behavior of slaves and denied them basic rights. Again, slave codes were laws that were very, very consistent among the Southern colonies that controlled the behavior of slaves and denied them basic rights, rights that whites were entitled to, white males were entitled to from birth. These were things that were routinely denied to slaves in the southern states. And finally, racism is the belief that one race is superior to another. We're going to be talking a lot about racism in the South and how that during the colonial period and how that during the first 100 years of our nation's history, how that was really responsible for a lot of the prejudice and a lot of the horrible treatment of African Americans in the early part of our nation's history. Racism, the belief that one race is superior to another. Now, if you guys can focus with me on the left-hand column here as we start our reading, the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland is known as the Mason-Dixon line. The border is known as the Mason-Dixon line, and the southern colonies lie south of this line. Everything south of Pennsylvania was considered a part of the original southern colonies, part of the south of the border that separates Pennsylvania from Maryland. Now, Maryland, which is one of the southern colonies, the farthest north southern colony, Maryland was founded as a place where Roman Catholics would be able to worship freely. And in 1649, the Act of Toleration ensured that all Christians could practice their beliefs there. Georgia, another southern colony, was founded as a place where debtors, people who were in debt from England, could make a new start in their life. We're going to read and look at an individual named Oglethorpe. And Mr. Oglethorpe was a person in debt in the state of Georgia, and we'll learn how, he was not a person in debt. He was a person who proposed the colony for debtors, and this would allow people who were in debt in England to kind of come to the Americas, North America, for a fresh start from their debt in England. The other 3 colonies in the South were Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. So of the southern colonies, we've got Maryland, Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Those colonies, Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, were founded mainly for farming and trade. Now, 2 ways of life develop in the southern colonies. 2 ways of life develop in the southern colonies, and we will be talking about this a lot this year. This way of life, or these ways of life, would be consistent in the colonial period, and they would be consistent in the American experience after the United States declared its independence and then won the Revolution. These 2 ways of life would be continuing on in our nation until 1865, when the Civil War ended and the institution of slavery was abolished. But for now, 2 ways of life developed in the southern colonies, and we'll look at the chart in a moment. Near the coast, large farms called plantations developed. So near the coast, the east coast of North America and the South, large farms called plantations developed, and plantation owners who were called planters, became very, very rich and very, very powerful, largely on the backs of slave laborers. Continuing on, backcountry life was very different. In the area of hills and thick forests, settlers had smaller farms and lived a simpler life in the South. So you had life along the coast that was filled with very, very large plantations or large farmlands that were worked by slaves. And then in the backcountry, you had very, very small farms and a much simpler life for these farmers. By 1700, slavery had become an important part of plantation life. Enslaved Africans cleared land. They raised crops of tobacco, rice, and indigo, and they tended livestock. They used farming skills they had brought from West Africa. For example, slaves showed English settlers how to grow rice. That was something that was brought to North America by African American slaves. As the use of slavery increased in the South, planters passed laws that put greater limits on the rights of slaves. Laws called slave codes treated Africans not as human beings, but treated Africans as property. And although some groups in the northern colonies objected to slavery, most colonists' racism allowed them to believe that the enslavement of African Americans was an acceptable practice. Now, there were some individuals and there were some groups in the North that opposed slavery early on in the colonial period. One of them we mentioned was the Quakers from Pennsylvania. But by and large, most Northerners, even though slavery would end in the North long before it ended in the South, in the colonial period, even Northerners who didn't own slaves as much as Southern plantation and farmers, Southern planters and farmers did, even most Northerners who didn't own slaves recognized that the right to own slaves was a right that Southerners certainly had in the South. So although some groups in the northern colonies objected to slavery, most colonists' racism allowed them to believe that the enslavement of Africans was an acceptable practice. And on our chart today, we're going to be looking at two ways of life in the southern colonies. And we highlighted a little bit of this just a moment ago in our reading when we talked about plantation life and we talked about backcountry life. Let's look at the two ways of life in the southern colonies. Plantation life consisted of slaves working on large farms, raising rice and tobacco. Not the only two crops that were raised in the colonial period. There will be others, and we're going to talk about cotton plantations, and we're going to be talking about other types of plantations as the year goes. But generally speaking, in the early period in the colonies, slaves worked on large farms raising rice and tobacco. Planters gained great wealth from exporting the crops. So the crops that were grown in the South were exported by these southern planters, these plantation owners, and they got very, very wealthy on the exportation of these crops, the shipping of these crops to the north and around the world as well. They got very, very wealthy. And they got very, very wealthy in large part because they were not paying the slave laborers who were doing all of the work on these plantations. All right, so plantation life involved planters gaining great wealth from exporting crops. Now, over to the right side of the chart, we've got backcountry life. How was life different in the backcountry, which would have been the woodsy areas of the South, away from the coastline, away from the large plantations? In the backcountry, settlers tended smaller farms and hunted game to survive. And some settlers might have a single or maybe two slaves, but generally speaking, settlers in the backcountry tended their own small farms. White settlers tended their own small farms and hunted game. Also, settlers led a very simple life filled with hardship. When we talk about settlers in the backcountry, these were people that had multiple challenges living in the backcountry. It was not an easy life. There were no stores, very few stores. There were places, there were no opportunities to buy supplies very often. all the things that a backcountry settler needed, he needed to provide for himself or for his family. And that's just the way it was. All right. Looking at the two questions that we are addressing in this mini lecture, we've got question one: how did enslaved Africans contribute to Southern plantations? How did enslaved Africans contribute to Southern plantations? I'll give you guys a moment to stop and look at the reading to formulate your response to that question. I'm certain that the response can be found in the reading. So take a moment and do that now. And our chart skills question is going to rely on the chart titled Two Ways of Life in the Southern Colonies. Chart question asks, how did the practice of farming differ in the two areas of the South? And what you're going to do is you're basically going to look at the chart. You're going to look at the two areas of the South that are discussed in the chart, and then you are going to answer the question, how did the practice of farming, how was farming different in the two areas of the South? And when we return for our next SMART lecture, we're going to be looking at the roots or the beginnings of self-government. The roots and the beginnings of self-government. That is government in which people are going to expect, or people are going to start to wonder and to take action about ways in which they can rule themselves in the colonies and not have to rely on leadership coming from 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean from Mother England.